How many times have you done exactly the right thing and still lost her? I'm not talking about being cruel. I'm not talking about betraying her or failing her in any obvious way. I mean, you did everything you were supposed to do. You were there when she needed you. You answered in seconds. You cancelled plans for her. You listened for hours when her world was falling apart. You said exactly what she wanted to hear. You were patient. You were considerate. You were completely devoted. And still, at some point, something broke. She drifted away slowly like a flame nobody feeds. Or maybe she never fully lit up at all, even though you threw every piece of wood you had at it. And the most disturbing part of all this isn't the outcome. The most disturbing part is that you don't understand why. Because if logic worked in this, if relationships were governed by the same laws that govern a contract or a business transaction, you would have won. The investment was enormous. The return should have been proportional. But it wasn't. And that left you with a question that has been gnawing at you for months, maybe years. What am I doing wrong? That question has an answer, and it's not the one you expect. I'm not going to tell you to be more mysterious or to stop replying for 24 hours to generate anxiety. That's cheap theatre, and we both know cheap theatre doesn't last. What I'm going to tell you today is something far deeper, something that has to do with the internal architecture of who you are and how that, your psychological structure, determines absolutely everything that happens between you and another person. Not as a technique, as a truth. And to get to that truth, I'm going to turn to someone who has been dead for 500 years and who nevertheless described with surgical precision something that most men today still haven't grasped. Niccolo Machiavelli wrote about power, about politics, about how it is won and how it is lost. But what he really did was map human psychology with an honesty that made everyone uncomfortable then, and that still makes people uncomfortable now because Machiavelli didn't say what people wanted to hear. He said what was, and what was includes this. Respect is not begged for. Attraction is not built with sacrifices. The power in any relationship belongs to whoever needs the other less. Not because they are cold, not because they are indifferent, but because they have something of their own to return to. I'm going to develop this slowly, carefully, because if you understand it superficially, you're going to draw dangerous conclusions. And wrong conclusions in this territory can hurt you more than ignorance. Start here. There is an experiment that psychologists have been replicating in various forms since the 1970s, and that always produces the same disturbing result. It's called the perceived scarcity effect, and it works like this. When something is abundant, its value decreases. When something is scarce, its value increases. This is not just economics. It is wired into our nervous system at a level that precedes language, that precedes even conscious thought. Your brain constantly evaluates what it has unlimited access to and what it doesn't. And what it has unlimited access to, it catalogues almost automatically as something that can wait, something that doesn't demand urgent attention. Now apply that to yourself. When you are available at every moment, when you reply before the message has even finished arriving, when you reorganize your entire week to fit into her plans, what signal are you sending? Not the one you think. You're not sending the signal that you care deeply. You're sending the signal that you have time to spare, that not too many things are competing for your attention, that she occupies first place on a list that perhaps doesn't have many items on it. And the human brain, even that of someone who genuinely appreciates you, registers that. Not as a virtue, as a warning. I didn't invent this. It was documented by Robert Cialdini, Daniel Kahneman, and dozens of researchers who studied how the human mind assigns value. But what is fascinating is that Machiavelli intuited it without laboratories, without data, without neuroimaging. He intuited it simply by observing people with a ruthless honesty. There is a passage in The Prince where Machiavelli speaks of something he calls the nature of men, that they are ungrateful, fickle, that they flee from danger and are eager for gain, and that it is safer to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. People quote this constantly as a display of cynicism. But if you read it carefully, it isn't cynicism. It's applied psychology centuries ahead of its time. He is not saying to be contemptible toward the people you love. He is saying that love without respect is fragile. That generosity without limits breeds contempt. That when you give everything without conditions, without structure, without the slightest friction, you don't provoke gratitude. You provoke a familiarity that kills desire. And here comes the first idea I want you to take away from today. The first of several that are going to change the way you understand this. Attraction does not live in comfort. Attraction lives in tension. Not the tension of drama, not the tension of manufactured conflict, but the tension produced by someone who has a life of their own, opinions they don't completely negotiate away, boundaries that don't collapse at the first pressure, and an energy that says, without words, that they can be with you, but don't need you to function. That tension is magnetic because it activates in the other person something that psychology calls approach motivation, the impulse to move towards something they don't quite have yet, something perceived as valuable precisely because it isn't completely within reach. When you eliminate that tension, when you surrender yourself without reservation from the very first moment, when you make sure she knows she can count on you for absolutely everything under any circumstance, approach motivation switches off. There is nothing left to move toward. She already has it all. But wait, because this is where people get lost and start drawing dangerous conclusions. This does not mean you have to fake disinterest. It doesn't mean you play at being busy when you're not. It doesn't mean you become someone cold, distant, calculating. People notice that, too, and it produces rejection, not attraction. What it means is something completely different, something that requires real internal work. It means you need to have a life that matters enough to you that your availability is naturally limited. It means you need to have opinions you defend, not because you want to impress her, but because they are genuinely yours. It means you need to have projects, friends, a direction of your own, something that demands your energy besides her, not as a strategy, as a reality. And here, the uncomfortable territory begins. Because if you honestly assess your situation and discover you don't have that your life at this moment revolves almost entirely around this person, or around getting this person, or around not losing her, then the problem isn't in what you do with her. The problem is in what you are not building for yourself. Machiavelli has another concept I want to bring in here. One he used in the context of government, but that works perfectly in this one. Fortune and virtue. Fortune is everything outside your control, circumstances, people, timing, luck. Virtue is everything within your control, your character, your skills, your preparation, your determination. And his central argument was that a man with virtue can bend even fortune, because fortune, he said, is like a flooded river. It devastates those who haven't prepared, but the dikes and channels you built before the flood decide how much damage it does. Apply that here. Fortune in a relationship is what you don't control. Whether she finds you attractive from the first moment, whether the timing is right, whether there is spontaneous chemistry, whether the circumstances of her life make her emotionally available. You don't decide that. But virtue, you do decide. And virtue in this context is who you are when you're not trying to impress anyone. It is the solidity of your character. It is the clarity of your values. It is the richness of your inner life. And what virtue does is something no technique can replicate. It produces authenticity. And authenticity, in a world where everyone is performing, where everyone is managing their image and calibrating their responses and measuring their words to produce the right effect, authenticity is devastatingly attractive. There is a study I find particularly revealing. It's called the self-disclosure effect, and it was published by psychologist Brené Brown in her research on vulnerability. What she found is counterintuitive at first glance. People who show themselves authentically, including their fears, their contradictions, form stronger and more lasting bonds than those who project an image of perfection or absolute control. But there is a crucial nuance that people miss when they cite this work. The vulnerability that creates connection is the kind that comes from a place of security. It is not the man who emotionally breaks down on the third date because he's afraid she'll leave. That is not vulnerability. That is need disguised as emotional openness. The vulnerability that connects is that of someone who says, "This is who I am, including the parts I'm still working on," and says it without asking permission, without seeking validation, without waiting for the other person to reassure them. They say it because they have enough of a relationship with themselves to hold themselves up, even if the response isn't what they hoped for. And that brings us to the principle that cost me the most to understand, and that once I understood it, changed absolutely everything. Self-acceptance is not the destination. It is the starting point. Most people work the other way around. They believe they first need external validation, the confirmation that they are desirable, that someone chooses them, that someone wants them, in order to then build a relationship from a place of security. First, let her confirm she likes me, and then I'll be able to relax and be myself. But it works exactly the other way around. First, you need to be yourself from a base of genuine self-knowledge and self-acceptance. And from there, you attract someone who connects with you, and not with the carefully edited version you built to make them like you. The practical difference between these two modes is enormous. When you seek validation first, every signal you receive from the other person carries tremendous weight because it determines how you feel about yourself. If she replies quickly, good. If she takes a while, you start interpreting, analyzing, searching for meaning in the silence. If she makes an ambiguous comment, you take it home and turn it over in your mind for hours. All your mental energy is invested in reading external signs because those external signs are what determine your internal state. And that dependence on external signals to regulate your internal state is exactly what the other person perceives. Not as something explicit, not as something they think consciously. They perceive it as a kind of weight, a kind of invisible pressure that makes being with you require a particular effort, that makes their reactions have consequences beyond what should be natural. And that pressure produces distance. It produces exactly the opposite of what you were seeking when you started investing all that energy. Now imagine the opposite. Imagine that your internal state doesn't depend on her signals, not because you don't care, but because you have enough internal structure that uncertainty doesn't destabilize you. You reply when you can and when you want to, not when the fear of losing her dictates that you must. You share what you think without calculating whether it will please her. When there is disagreement, you don't panic and you don't fold immediately to restore harmony. You simply are. Present, but not anxious. Interested, but not dependent. That energy, that way of being in a relationship, is what social psychology calls an internal secure base, and it activates something in the other person that no technique can manufacture. Trust. The feeling that you are talking to someone real. Someone who is not performing, someone whose presence has consistency because it isn't built on fear of their reaction. Machiavelli would put it something like this. A prince who governs from fear of being dethroned makes decisions that weaken him. A prince who governs from the strength of his own convictions can even afford to be generous without appearing weak, because generosity that comes from abundance carries a completely different weight than generosity that comes from desperation. And that brings me to the second principle I want to develop today, the difference between choosing and needing. When you invest in someone from a place of need, from the fear of losing her, from the anxiety that she'll leave if you don't do enough, that investment has a particular flavor. The other person perceives it, even if they can't name it. They sense that you are not choosing her freely. They sense that you are holding on to her, and being held onto is not the same as being desired. Nobody wants to be someone's anchor. Nobody wants to feel that if they leave, someone else sinks. That is not a compliment. It is a burden. When you invest from a place of choice, when you give your time and attention because you want to, not because you fear what will happen if you don't, that investment carries an entirely different weight. It is perceived as a gift, as something that comes from a place of abundance, as something that doesn't depend on fear, but on the genuine desire to build something with that specific person. The paradox is that in order to truly choose, you have to be capable of not choosing her. You have to be capable of walking away, not as a threat, not as a manipulation tactic, but as a real possibility you have integrated. The possibility that this might not work, and you will still be a whole person. The possibility that she decides not to continue, and you don't lose the thread of your own life. And this capacity, the ability to walk away, is what produces in you the attitude that psychologists call secure attachment. Secure attachment doesn't mean you don't care. It means your sense of self doesn't depend on the outcome of this relationship. It means you can be completely present and emotionally invested without losing sight of who you are outside of this. There is fascinating research on attachment styles that began with John Bowlby and was continued by Mary Ainsworth and dozens of other researchers. What they discovered is that the attachment styles we learn in childhood tend to replicate themselves in our adult relationships, but that with conscious work, they can be modified. And the attachment style that produces the healthiest, most satisfying relationships, and this is what I find most revealing, the most attractive to the other person, is secure attachment. People with secure attachment don't have fewer emotional needs than people with anxious attachment. They have the same needs. What they have differently is the capacity to tolerate uncertainty without panicking, the capacity to communicate their needs without turning them into demands, the capacity to trust the process without needing constant reassurance that everything is fine. And what this produces in the dynamic of a relationship is completely different. The person with anxious attachment, who seeks constant validation, who needs permanent signals that the other is still there and still interested, generates a dynamic that is exhausting, that produces the feeling that being their partner is a job, that makes the other feel observed, evaluated, measured, responsible for managing someone else's emotions on top of their own. The person with secure attachment, on the other hand, generates a dynamic where the other person feels free to be authentic because not so much is riding on every interaction, free to have a bad day without it causing a crisis, free to disagree without the world collapsing. And that freedom is, paradoxically, what creates the deepest connection. Machiavelli would put it another way. He would say that the leader who constantly needs confirmation from his subordinates to feel secure in his position is the one most easily manipulated. The one who governs himself from within is the one who truly holds power. Now I want to talk about something that few people mention in this context because it requires an honesty that makes people uncomfortable. Boundaries. Not boundaries as rules you impose to punish or control. Boundaries as an honest description of what you can and cannot accept based on your values. Boundaries are a declaration of who you are, not of who you want her to be. When you have no clear boundaries, when you accept things that don't actually sit right with you because you fear that conflict will push her away, you are building the relationship on a falsehood. And structural falsehoods in a relationship don't disappear. They grow. They accumulate. And over time, they produce either an explosion or a silent erosion that turns something that could have been beautiful into something that simply empties out. But there is something else the absence of boundaries does. Something that happens at a psychological level in the other person and that very few people dare to say. When you have no boundaries, you lose respect. Not always consciously, not always deliberately, but there is something in human psychology that associates boundaries with self-esteem and the absence of boundaries with desperation. And when someone perceives that they can treat you any way they like without consequences, their perception of you changes. It doesn't improve. It doesn't produce gratitude. It produces, at best, indifference. At worst, contempt. I recall reading a study published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology some years ago that examined how people evaluate their partners in terms of respect. And one of the most consistent findings was that the ability to say no, the ability to have a boundary and defend it calmly but firmly, correlated strongly with being perceived as someone with high self-esteem. And perceived high self-esteem, in turn, correlated with the other person's desire to maintain and deepen the relationship. In other words, when you say no, when you genuinely want to say no, when you defend what is non-negotiable to you, when your position doesn't collapse at the first sign of disagreement, you are communicating something that no gift, no gesture, no display of affection can communicate with the same effectiveness, that you respect yourself. And someone who respects themselves is someone who deserves respect. Machiavelli wrote that whoever does not know how to defend themselves cannot count on others to defend them. There is something in that idea that transcends politics and lands directly in the psychology of personal relationships. You cannot expect someone to treat you well if you yourself have not established, through your behavior, what treating you well means. But boundaries have an additional dimension I want to explore, because if you only think of them as lines that cannot be crossed, as rules about what is acceptable and what isn't, you are stopping at the most surface level. Boundaries are also a tool for self-knowledge, because to have a real boundary, one that isn't performative, that you don't set to impress or to appear as someone with character, you have to know what you value. You have to know what you need for a relationship to nourish you rather than drain you. You have to have sat with yourself long enough to distinguish what is negotiable from what forms part of your core. And that process, that work of self-knowledge, is precisely what most people avoid because it is uncomfortable, because it requires honesty, because in that process you discover things about yourself that are not always pleasant. You discover patterns that repeat. You discover fears you didn't know you had. You discover the reasons why you accept things you shouldn't accept. But it is in that process where what Machiavelli would call virtue is built. Not virtue in the moral sense, but the strength of character that makes you capable of acting from your principles, even when doing so is costly. I want to pause here for a moment to address something that might sound contradictory to everything I've been saying. I've been talking about independence, about boundaries, about not needing external validation, about having a life of your own. And someone might think this sounds cold, that this sounds like a strategy of emotional distance, that I'm describing someone who doesn't allow themselves to feel, who manages their emotions the way an accountant manages a spreadsheet. No, not at all. The opposite. What I'm describing is the foundation that makes real intimacy possible. Because real intimacy, that depth of connection we all seek, even if we're not always able to name it, cannot be built between one person who is completely themselves and another who is being what they believe the first wants them to be. Real intimacy requires both people to be present, completely, with everything they are. And to be completely present, to be able to show yourself truly without constantly calculating how what you show is going to affect the other, you need that internal secure base I've been describing. You need to know that you can be rejected and survive. You need to know that your worth doesn't depend on this particular relationship working out. You need to know that you have enough within yourself not to fall apart if she decides not to continue. When you have that, when that foundation is built, you can do something that is paradoxically the most courageous and most intimate thing that exists. You can open up for real, not to obtain something, not to produce an effect, but because you genuinely want someone to know you. And that openness, when it comes from a place of security and not desperation, when it is a choice and not a disguised plea, is the most powerful thing there is in terms of creating connection. Brené Brown, whose research I mentioned earlier, has a phrase that captures this with a precision I find masterful. Vulnerability is the birthplace of connection. But she is also very clear that vulnerability is not weakness. It is the willingness to show yourself without guarantees. Without guarantees, that is the key. You cannot show yourself authentically if you need a guarantee that the response will be what you expect. If you need that guarantee, then what you're doing is not vulnerability. It's a transaction. I give this. I expect that. And emotional transactions, even when they work in the short term, don't produce deep connection. They produce emotional debt and resentment. Now, I want to talk about the third principle, which is perhaps the most counterintuitive of all, the importance of not over-investing at the beginning. There is a tendency I notice in many men, especially in those who genuinely want to build something meaningful with someone, to pour all their energy in from the very first moment. To demonstrate, through the intensity of their investment, the seriousness of their intentions. To convince, through gestures and attention and availability, that they are someone worth choosing. I understand the impulse. It comes from a real place. It comes from the desire for the other person to know that this isn't casual, that there is something here that matters. But the problem isn't the intention. The problem is the effect. When you invest massively in someone who has not yet responded with a comparable investment, you are creating an imbalance. And imbalances in relationships are uncomfortable for both parties. You experience them as anxiety because you have bet a great deal without any guarantees. She experiences them as pressure because your investment creates in her an expectation of reciprocity she may not be ready to assume or simply may not feel. And here is something worth understanding from the psychology of decision-making. When someone feels they have an emotional debt to another person, that they have received more than they have given, they have two options. The first is to reciprocate, to return the energy with equal intensity. The second, which is the most common when the debt is large and early, is to flee, to pull away to escape the pressure of having to give back something they never asked for. This has a name in social psychology. It's called reactance theory. When we perceive that someone is trying to commit us to a particular response through the intensity of their investment, we tend to resist. To do exactly the opposite of what we are being pressured to do. Not because we are cruel, but because psychological freedom is one of the most fundamental values we have. The solution is not to stop investing. It's to invest proportionally to what actually exists at this moment. It's to let the investment grow at the pace of the relationship. It's for your enthusiasm to be real, but calibrated. For your presence to be consistent, but not suffocating. For your interest to be expressed, but to leave space for the other person to move toward you as well. Machiavelli spoke of prudence as one of the essential virtues of the prince. Not prudence understood as timidity or lack of ambition. Prudence as the ability to read the moment correctly and act accordingly, neither getting ahead of things nor falling behind, moving when movement makes sense. In a nascent relationship, prudence looks something like this. You are completely present when you are present, but you are not everywhere all the time. You express interest clearly, but you don't need constant confirmation that the interest is returned. You let things develop at a natural pace without forcing the pace with the intensity of your anxiety. And now I want to connect all of this to something I believe is the core of the entire conversation, the source from which your value comes. There are two ways of understanding one's own value. The first is external. My value depends on how others treat me, on whether I am liked, on whether I am chosen, on achievements that others can see and recognize. The second is internal. My value comes from the relationship I have with myself, from the coherence between what I believe and what I do, from the quality of my thoughts and actions, regardless of whether anyone else is watching. Most people live with a mixture of the two, some internal value, some external value. But the problem arises when the balance tips too far toward the external. When internal value is insufficient, any negative signal from the outside becomes an existential threat. A person who rejects you is not simply someone who decided not to continue. They are evidence that you are not enough. 3 hours of silence is not simply silence. It's a signal that something has changed, that you have failed at something, that you must do something to restore the situation. And that interpretation, that tendency to read external events as confirmations or refutations of your internal value, is precisely what produces the behaviors that destroy attraction. Overinvestment, excessive availability, the constant search for validation, collapsing at the first sign of disagreement. They are all desperate attempts to obtain from the outside what you don't have on the inside. The good news, and I want to be very clear about this, is that it can be worked on. Not with a technique, not with a self-help book that gives you 5 steps to being more confident. It's worked on with time, with honesty, with the willingness to look at the parts of yourself that you don't find comfortable. Sometimes with therapy, sometimes with spiritual work, sometimes simply with the sustained practice of doing difficult things that nobody is watching. Because internal value is built with actions, not with affirmations in the mirror, not with visualizations, with the record which accumulates in your personal history, that you are someone who follows through on what you set out to do, who can tolerate discomfort without giving up, who acts from their values even when it costs something, who can be alone and not fall apart. Machiavelli held the idea that a man's character is revealed in moments of adversity, not when everything is going well. When things get complicated, when there is uncertainty, when the outcome isn't guaranteed, and it is there, in those moments, where you see what someone is made of, and where they begin to know it themselves. Every time you handle the uncertainty of a relationship with calm instead of anxiety, you are building evidence for yourself that you are someone who can do that. Every time you communicate something difficult honestly instead of avoiding it out of fear of conflict, you are building that evidence. Every time you hold your position in a disagreement instead of folding to restore the peace, you are building that evidence. And that accumulated evidence is what gives you, over time, an internal value that doesn't depend on the response of any particular person, a value you can carry into any relationship without needing that relationship to confirm it. There is something else I want to explore because I believe it is one of the most common and most damaging mistakes men make when they want to connect with someone. Confusing agreement with being likable and confusing disagreement with the risk of losing the connection. There exists this idea that in order for someone to like you, You have to agree with what they think. That harmony is the sign of connection. That disagreement threatens the bond, and that therefore, when a difference of opinion arises, the most intelligent thing to do is to soften it, minimize it, or simply accommodate your position to hers to avoid the tension. This is, in psychological terms, a monumental mistake. People who completely agree with everything you say don't interest you. They make you comfortable. And comfort and interest are very different things. Comfort doesn't activate attention. It doesn't produce that sting of stimulation that makes you want to keep talking to someone, keep getting to know them, keep exploring their mind. Disagreement does. Not aggressive disagreement, not hostile conflict, not systematic contradiction as a manipulation tactic, but genuine disagreement. The kind that emerges naturally when two people with their own criteria meet and don't think exactly alike. That kind of disagreement says something fundamental about the person who holds it. That they have a mind of their own, that they aren't modeling their thinking on what they believe you want to hear, that you can trust that what they tell you is what they actually think. And that trust in the other's authenticity, is the foundation of deep connection, not the absence of conflict, the presence of authenticity. What psychologists call productive tension. The ability to hold differences without needing to resolve them immediately, without panicking when two positions don't fit together perfectly, is one of the clearest signs of emotional maturity. And emotional maturity, contrary to what many believe, is tremendously attractive. Because emotional maturity says, I can be with you without losing you and without losing myself. I can listen to you genuinely without it, meaning I adopt your perspective. I can have a position without needing it to be the only valid one. I can tolerate that we are different without that being a threat. Machiavelli, in his personal letters, revealed something curious. Despite his public image as a cold calculator, he was a man who valued deeply intellectual conversation, the debate of ideas, the meeting of minds that could confront each other without destroying each other. He believed that the highest virtue was not the one that never made mistakes, but the one that could learn even from an adversary. There is something in that idea that is profoundly applicable to relationships. The person worth building something with is not the one who always agrees with you. It's the one who challenges you, who makes you think, who occupies their place in the conversation with a real presence, who doesn't dissolve into your opinions, but brings their own. And if you want to be that person for someone else, you have to practice the same. Being truly present with your own perspectives, your own contradictions, your own mind. And this brings us to the last principle of today, which is not really a technique or a strategy. It is an existential stance. And it is the most difficult of all because it demands something that contemporary culture rarely celebrates. The complete acceptance of who you are right now without waiting to improve, without conditions, without turning your self-love into a promise you will make to yourself once you have reached some standard you don't yet have. Self-acceptance is not resignation. This confusion is enormous and causes a great deal of damage. Accepting yourself does not mean you stop growing. It doesn't mean you celebrate your weaknesses as though they were virtues. It doesn't mean you stop working on the parts of yourself you want to change. It means something far more precise. It means that at this moment, with everything you are and everything you are not yet, you have a value that is not conditioned on the outcome of any particular relationship. It means you can show up exactly as you are, with your contradictions and your insecurities and your mistakes and your half-finished projects, without needing any external outcome to confirm that you deserve to be here. And this stance, this way of relating to yourself, produces an effect that is almost impossible to manufacture artificially. It produces peace, a kind of inner stillness that people physically perceive when they are near you. Not anxiety disguised as confidence. Not the effort of someone trying to appear calm, but the real calm of someone who has nothing to prove. Because when you have nothing to prove, when your internal value doesn't depend on what happens in this conversation or in this relationship, you can do something extraordinary. You can be completely in the present, not in the future, calculating how they are going to respond to what you're about to say. Not in the past, reviewing whether you did something wrong last time. In the present, with all your attention on what is actually happening between the two of you. And real presence, complete attention, without agenda, without fear, without calculation, is probably the rarest and most valuable gift another person can give you, because we live in an age of chronic distraction, where everyone is partially somewhere else, and the person who can be completely here, completely with you, without dividing their attention between the past and the future, and the phone and their worries, that person is magnetic in a way that transcends any technique. Machiavelli, toward the end of his life, wrote a letter to his friend Francesco Vettori that is perhaps one of the most surprising texts he left behind. In it, he described how, at the end of the day, he would take off the dirty clothes from working in the fields and put on his court attire and enter the room where his books were kept and converse for hours with the great men of antiquity, with Dante, with Livy, with Cicero. And he said that in that conversation, he felt neither the cold nor the weariness. That time disappeared, that he was completely himself. That image of a man who has found something that belongs to him completely, something nobody can take from him, something that makes him fully himself, is exactly the image of what we have been describing. Not that of someone who has found the perfect person to feel complete. That of someone who is already complete, and from that completeness can choose with whom to share what they have. The difference between looking for someone to complete you and sharing with someone what you already are is not semantic. It is the difference between a relationship that rests on fear and a relationship that rests on choice. And relationships that rest on choice have a durability and a depth that the others can never reach, no matter how intensely they begin. Everything we have explored today converges on a single point, not on a technique, not on a set of rules to follow, on a way of being. A way of being that includes a life of your own that matters, boundaries that reflect real values, the capacity to tolerate disagreement without falling apart, an emotional investment that grows at the pace of the relationship and not at the pace of your anxiety, and a relationship with yourself that doesn't depend on external validation to sustain itself. This is not built overnight. There is no shortcut. And that is, paradoxically, good news, because it means that the work you do here has deep roots, that it is not a disguise you can lose at the first moment of pressure, that it becomes who you are. And who you are, in the end, is the only thing that attracts in a genuine and lasting way. Not what you appear to be, not what you do, who you are. Machiavelli ended many of his writings with a variation of the same thought. Whoever does not govern himself cannot govern anything. I would put it this way, adapted to this context. Whoever does not choose himself cannot truly be chosen. So, start there. Not in the message you send, not in the gesture you make, not in the technique you apply. Start with yourself. Start building something inside worth showing. Start knowing yourself well enough to understand what you need and what you won't tolerate. Start living in a way that earns you self-respect, the kind nobody can take from you. Not because nobody tries, but because it doesn't depend on anyone. When you have that, everything else changes. Not because you've learned to act differently, but because you genuinely are someone different. And that difference, the difference between someone who searches and someone who has, between someone who needs and someone who chooses, between someone who begs for attention and someone who simply is, that difference changes everything. The real power in any human relationship, and Machiavelli knew this, even if he didn't put it in these terms, is not in what you do. It is in who you are when you are not trying to do anything at all. If you made it to the end of this video, comment, "I made it," and I will personally reply to you. And if this resonated with you, subscribe to be part of this and give it a like if you enjoyed it.